This is the Fusion Factor.
Hello, my name is Justin Oldham, and I am the author of Tales from the Kodiak Starport. Critics have classified it as Alaska-themed science fiction, and I'm rather proud of it myself. I'm happy to wear that label. For a wide variety of reasons, both historical and geographical, Alaska is going to play a big role in world events in the 21st century, and that makes it a very good place to set military fiction, science fiction, stories about the human struggle for space travel, and stuff like that. You know, good old-fashioned political adventure. I say political because, honestly, politics are in my genes. Anything and everything is political or can be made political, and that does include space travel. Alaska is, by historical date of inclusion, the 49th state in the Union, and we are sometimes called the last frontier. Some of that stems from the fact that many of us still continue to lead rather rustic lifestyles. There are still a few vestiges of the old Russian imperial colonialist period left over, and as you drive around or fly around the state, one of the things that you'll notice is a great deal of independent living. It's what the folks down in the lower 48 would call off the grid. But, you know, we're studying contrasts, and while some of us do in fact live in log cabins without running water or electricity, we are also possessed of some very high-tech industries. And I first heard about the concept of a space launch complex to be built on Kodiak Island in 1995, and then later on in 1997 when the joint venture was launched between the state of Alaska, which put up some seed money, and private sector investors who put up some seed money to start the Alaska Aerospace Development Corporation. Well, hey, and I was completely and totally taken by the idea of an Alaskan starport, because when you stop and think about it, a space launch complex 100, 200 years into the future is, as it grows and develops, just like a human being would, eventually a humble rocket launch complex eventually can grow into a burgeoning starport. Now, there in the year of 1997, that did sound all well and good, but I was working 40 to 50 hours a week, chasing the paycheck, and there was no time for the writing. And I put this idea in my back pocket, and I just assumed that it was so good that somebody else would beat me to it. Well, for whatever reason, nobody did beat me to it, and so it was in the summer of 2006, I settled in and I started putting this thing together. I first asked myself if I would do this as a novel or as a short story collection, and after some serious probative thinking, I opted for the short story collection simply because I wanted to answer one very significant question. How deep was the well? What sort of opportunities could I be looking at here for future sequels? I am something of a mercenary at heart, and if there's commercial potential in something, then I want to know about it. So I started drafting short stories. Now, ultimately, what you have here is a collection of 8 short stories. I initially penned 7, which then grew to 11. And after some editorial feedback from people I trusted, we selected the final 8 that you see in this book, and that's how they were arranged, and that's what you have today. That short story collection took approximately 9 months to put together, 3 months to put through the editorial process, and so by calendar year 2007, I was ready to get this thing into print, but there was no Shadow Fusion books at that time, so I shopped it around, and the publisher who said yes was Silver Thought Press based out of Philadelphia, New York. And I worked with them to get this book into print, and we stayed with them for a while. And then in 2011, we parted ways, and I then took up relations with Shadow Fusion Books, and we relaunched this title in 2012. And I'll let you in on a little secret here. I actually had the sequel to Tales from the Kodiak Starport in the can around about Christmas of 2011, but you can't tell anybody because it's a secret. But we published again in 2012, and I thought about what should come next, and I've actually started penning the third book. I have another idea, another angle that I want to explore in relation to a potential future Kodiak Starport, but hey, we're gonna have to save that for a future podcast. So with all this in mind, let's take a quick commercial break, pay a few bills, and when we come back on the other side, I'll share with you some of my thoughts about each of the short stories contained in Tales from the Kodiak Starport.
This program is brought to you by Shadow Fusion Books.
The book begins with a foreword written by myself that explains a great deal of what I've already said in this podcast. It lays out my motivations for putting together this short story collection. Now that's followed up by an early history of the Kodiak Starport, and this is a fictional account, if you will. You can think of it as the first story in the whole collection, if you like, but it is otherwise a fictional account of how the Kodiak Space Launch Complex transforms into an actual full-blown starport as science fiction writers have thought of that concept for the last 5 or 6 decades. Now, there have been a few people who have taken issue with my characterizations of what a starport is and how this particular installation gets its rather rocky start. Now, I don't mind saying that. I think we've got some trying times in our future, but I also think that starports are places where you can have all kinds of intrigues going on. You can have romances, and you can have political thrillers, and you can have everything else transpiring in between that you'd care to write about. So anybody else who wants to write about this sort of thing in the environments that they create should not feel limited. The historian in me looks ahead into the next few decades, 2013 all the way through 2030, and I do see the very real possibility of some tremendous shifts in geopolitical situations, and I do see some very real potential for conflicts between the United States and China, and that means quite a few countries in the Asia-Pacific Rim get caught in the middle of all that. By extension, a big, huge, vulnerable, sprawling starport that happened to be on the island of Kodiak, just for example, would also happen to be caught right in the middle of a very large battlefield between two major warring powers. And when you're a commercial entity that's trying to be neutral, that's not a very friendly place to be. So what do? Well, I, as a fiction writer, I've decided to dip my ink in the well and take a look at what this future might hold, and honestly, what I see is war. So, with that in mind, I began this anthology with a short story titled Necessary Measures.
Well, it's big and terrible. More frightening than I ever thought possible.
Well, okay, he's not entirely wrong here, because the thing that most interested me is the fact that the starport of the future is not going to be just a little airstrip with a little aluminum shack next to it. This thing is likely to be what amounts to an actual multinational corporation. The starport, as science fiction writers have theorized, is going to be an absolutely massive industrial installation that will be a city stacked on top of a space launch complex surrounded by factories and refineries. They're going to employ thousands or even tens of thousands of people to push millions of tons of cargo and move hundreds of thousands of people on a daily basis. You don't do all of that on just a little bit of real estate, and because all of that stuff has to be spread out over a large area, it actually makes it all kind of vulnerable, and because these are non-hardened civilian facilities, makes them rather vulnerable to strategic military attacks. So again, I put on my thinking hat and I asked myself, okay, so let's see now. If you own yourself a very large, expensive, squishy, vulnerable multinational corporation that happens to provide a service that's vital to humanity, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the midst of a war zone, what are you going to do about it? What necessary measures will you take in order to ensure the survivability of your company? Now, after some research, a couple interviews with some very interesting people, I discovered that the answers to those questions are not necessarily socially acceptable, and some of them are politically incorrect, to say the least.
You're despicable.
Maybe so, but there were still some real-world factors in there that were very fascinating to me, and I wanted to bring them to the people who read this book in a way that would actually, be thought-provoking. I wanted to give you something to think about more than just a feel-good story and an interesting vision of the future, which is why I followed Necessary Measures with the second short story in this anthology entitled Real Money.
Money never sleeps, pal.
No, it doesn't, which is why I wanted to spend some of my word count taking a closer look at private sector business inside a starport, but I wanted to put a little twist on it, and I wanted to take a closer look at small business. Now, multinational corporations that would own, operate, and make a starport go, and that's one thing. They're going to be a constant backdrop. But the small companies, the startups, the hundreds, the thousands of these little tiny companies that would exist inside a larger capitalistic starport. What do we know about them? What can we theorize about them? Well, that's what I decided to take a closer look at in this story. Now, this is actually a multifaceted collection of short stories, and I don't want you to get the wrong idea and go away from this podcast thinking that Tales from the Kodiak Starport is all of just one thing. So with that in mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the third story in this collection, which is called Combat Fishing. And while it does take a serious look at very serious ecological issues related to the depletion of the fishing grounds in and around Alaska, it also does it with a little bit of humor, if you will. This is the funny piece in the collection. This is my effort at telling a few jokes that mean more to Alaskans than they do to the rest of the world.
Watch your language, you bud. We're on the air.
Yeah. This is clean, trust me. Actually, the entire collection, all 8 stories, have been written to approximately the 9th and 10th grade reading level, in case anybody cares. So let's take a break, let me get a glass of water, and when we come back, I'll tell you about the other 4 short stories in Tales from the Kodiak Starport.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
We got your 6 and there's nothing you can do about it.
The 5th short story in this collection is titled The Price We Pay, and we focus again on the Starport administration, and we're back to looking at big picture themes, and we're taking a different perspective on the role of the multinational corporation in the war zone. what's neutrality and what is loyalty to the sponsoring nation? These are going to be difficult questions for any multinational corporation to answer in the next World War. Now, this particular combination of conundrums gets to be a little bit stickier when you stop to realize that a starport has unique considerations. What exactly do they do? They provide spaceflight services. That's a fairly narrow range of services when you think about the private sector buffet. But these guys also have to look after their subsidiary companies, and they have to be mindful of the fact that in certain cases they have one-of-a-kind facilities. They have some capabilities that don't exist anywhere else on planet Earth. And so if they're lost, that means institutional knowledge that could take 20, 30, 50 years to get back. And the more advanced a society becomes, you've heard the old saying before, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Well, if you lose a starport, whether it is to a war or to a meteor strike or anything else, you are falling down the technological ladder very far. And so the people who run that starport, they're going to know that. They're going to feel just a teeny bit vulnerable to all of that. So what are they going to do about it? The ultimate question to be asked is, in this particular short story, what price do we pay for our survival as a starport?
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Well, you're not the only one who thinks that, and the editorial advice I got when compiling this collection is what caused us to include the next short story. Number 6 is entitled The Meat Wagon. And for those of you who don't know, meat wagon is a slang term often used to describe ambulances. And in this particular case, what you actually have here is a story about a space-going ambulance. And you will get to ride along with a crew that takes off from the ground and goes to a space station to pick up a patient who is in distress and bring them back down to the ground. This is a technology that's in our future. I'm probably going to live long enough to see it. And any functioning starport that happens to evolve in the next 100 years is going to need first responders. They're going to need emergency management services. And while I did not choose to focus on police departments specifically, ambulances, it seemed like a good fit for this particular anthology. So that's what you got in this particular story.
Though my eyes can see, I still was a blind man. Though my mind could think, I still was a madman. I hear the voices when I'm dreaming. I can hear them say,
Starports of the future will be wonderful places to go through and to experience, and I imagine they'll be tremendously majestic things, especially if you can see them. And that was something I wanted to tinker with in short story number 7, entitled There Are None So Blind. Now, it's no secret that I myself am legally blind. I have, as a matter of fact, just one eye. And it's unlikely that I'm going to live long enough to see a lot of the starport technologies that I'm writing about. So, with that in mind, I decided to indulge in a little bit of fantasy because, I'll let you in on another little secret here. One of the things that those of us who do not see very well sometimes think about, especially when nobody's around late at night, we sometimes wonder what it would be like to see normally, or even to just see better than we do. So what would we do with it? What could we do with it? How would it change our lives? And how might we somehow make greater contributions to the world than we already do if we had better eyesight? Well, that's an interesting question. And so I decided to put on my storyteller's hat and take a stab at it with this particular piece, and you'll have to let me know what you think of the results, because there are certain aspects to it which, honestly, I'm saying this as the guy who wrote it, if you're not visually impaired, you may not get it. Okay, that little bit of self-indulgence aside, I had to then make the command decision about how was this short story collection going to end. What did we want to finish with? Now, advice from the editorial team was to go with something else. I don't want to say what that is, but ultimately, after kicking it around for a few days, a couple sleepless nights, I settled on number 8, which you have here is Coming Home. Now, once you take the buildings and all the technology away from a starport, you are left with the people. And as good as we are, as smart as we are, there are times when we are still at the mercy of our darker natures, and we have to answer for the things that we have done. And so I thought it would be interesting to focus on the good and the bad in people in a starport. That may sound a bit metaphysical, but ultimately I think that starports have the potential to represent both the good in humanity and the bad in humanity because they enshrine our military and commercial capabilities. Therefore, it's good and bad all under one roof. And so the hero in this piece, he is coming home. And to a certain extent, he is coming home to a reckoning as well as a hero's welcome. And to have both of these events transpiring in what amounts to just a few hours, that would be terribly uncomfortable for some people. And there is a happy ending here. I don't want to say what it is because obviously I want you to read the book. But the ending does tie in to the larger ethos that I've tried to create for this whole thing because the starport as a science fiction theme to me is symbolic of human potential. And that, in a nutshell, is my very brief overview of Tales from the Kodiak Starport, published by Shadow Fusion Books in 2012. If you have any questions or comments, please go to shadowfusionbooks.com, or you can look me up on the internet. You can find my personal website at justin-oldham.com. Thank you for your time, and have a good day.
You've been listening to The Fusion Podcast, brought to you by Shadow Fusion Books. Find us online at shadowfusionbooks.com.